Okay, hello and welcome to the 8:30 Live. And YouTube just kicked in, so hello and welcome to the 8:30 Live. So today got my computer in mind. Today there's actually not that much local news to talk about, but we are going to spend a little bit of time sort of unusually on some international news that's going on. But before we do, by request, I'm going to go over two pieces of information which are critical to voters here in New York. The first is the NYC Pandemic Vote Fact, which I put together. I sent out an email about this today. Somebody got it and was like, can you cover this in your live? And I was like, okay, we shall. And I also sent out my explanation on how delegate voting works. Now, we've covered this once or twice before, but there's always new folks watching the live. So I just want to go over this to make sure that everybody understands how this works so they can make informed decisions. We're going to talk a little bit about voting strategy for president. And then, of course, any questions, feel free to leave them. But first, just a PSA from the voting fact. Today is the last day to request your absentee ballot. You may be aware, hopefully you are, that Governor Cuomo basically said that we can have vote by mail in New York State this year to deal with the pandemic. So in order to do that, you have to request your ballot. It doesn't just get sent to you as in a true vote by mail program. Still, this is better than nothing because instead of having to affirm that you have a reason for voting, you can just check off the pandemic option and it applies to everybody. But if you want an absentee ballot, today is the last possible day to request it. Hello, Simon. Always good to see you. Simon says hello. Today is the last possible day to request it. So please head over to nycabsentee.com or you can call 866-VOTE-NYC, which is 866-868-3692. You can also email a signed form or request more information at absenteejune2020@boe.nyc. Finally, insofar as absentee ballot, if you want to pick one up in person, which almost defeats the point of getting an absentee ballot, but if you're just that kind of adventurous, you can pick up an absentee ballot in person at your county board of elections until the day before election day. So that's until June 22nd. But then you have to mail it the same day because all absentee ballots need to be mailed the day before election day, which is June 22nd. Election day being June 23rd. Now, the other thing to know about your absentee ballot, in case you're filling these out, don't forget to flip over the envelope and sign and date the back. If you don't do that, your absentee ballot will be invalid. The only other way to invalidate your ballot is to vote for more people than you're allowed to. Overvotes invalidate the ballot. Undervotes make no difference. Filling in that part that says only for Board of Elections use doesn't make a difference. I mean, you shouldn't do it, but it's not going to invalidate your ballot. Now, the reason that going to get your absentee ballot is kind of ridiculous right now is because New York State also has early voting. So you have early voting in person from June 13th, which was last Sunday, till June 21st. Then there's a 2-day gap between election day. I don't really know why, but whatever. The hours are variable, so you have to look them up. There's weekend polling times, there's midday polling times, there's evening polling times. If you live in New York City, head to nyc.pollsitelocator.com. If you had to be watching me from outside of New York City, head to voterlookup.elections.ny.gov. It's just not quite as nice, but New York City residents can use that one too. Finally, in-person election day, June 23rd. Again, same poll locator information, but since there's now more people watching in the last 5 seconds, I'm going to say it. nyc.pollsitelocator.com for New York City residents. For state poll locators, for everybody else in New York State, voterlookup.elections.ny.gov. Now, I want to go over the races that you can look for because this can be really, really confusing to folks. Before we talk about presidential delegates and voting strategy and explaining all of that, I want to say when in New York, we have a pretty messed up law, which basically says that if you don't have a contested race, that race won't appear on your ballot. So I'm going to go through everything that you could be voting for. And when you look at your ballot, just know if you don't see what I'm talking about, you've got a problem in your neighborhood. It means that people aren't competing and running against each other, and you are being deprived of choice. So get involved in your local Democratic, little d Democratic election process and run some folks. So races to look for. Federal elections. First, you've got your Democratic nominee for U.S. president, right? We're going to talk about that in a second. You've got your delegate to the Democratic National Convention. Now, those two things are separate, even though people tend to think of them together. Again, we're going to go into it in a second. And third, you've got your U.S. House races. So that's Congress, although technically Congress means the House of Representatives and the Senate. So all of the House of Representatives, folks, are up this year. Make sure you see that on your ballot. This is a Democratic primary, so if you're not a registered Democrat, this isn't for you. But if you're not a registered Democrat, I highly encourage you to vote, and rather to register as a Democrat in New York City, because that's basically where all the competition is. If you're voting in that Republican primary, you're not getting a lot of bang for your buck unless you're outside of New York City, and at this point, really north of Westchester. Unless, of course, you're in Staten Island, in which case, okay, it can have some impact. Now, for state level elections, all state senators are up for grabs, all of the state assembly, and your state party committee offices are up. So, for example, I'm a Democratic state committee man. We're almost never challenged, but there are a lot of folks running in Queens who are reformers taking on the establishment, and in Brooklyn, and some in the Bronx, and all of these folks, your Democratic state committee members and your Democratic district leaders. So that's for your county party and your state party leadership. And this is the same for all of your parties, including the Republicans. Although you may or may, if there's no contest and there's no other elections, you won't have a primary. You won't have an election where you live, which is pretty messed up. But that's just how we do it in New York. But almost everywhere is having a Democratic primary. So look to see if your Democratic leadership elections are actually contested and taking place. Now, that's state committee and that's everywhere. We also have county and borough races. So for example, local to your county or your borough are your civil court judges. We've got civil court judges running all around New York. You've got your political party district leaders. And this is only for Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. Not Manhattan, not Staten Island. We're next year. Now, one thing to note, in Brooklyn, your state committee and your district leaders fused. So you don't get separate elections for that. So just pay attention. Be careful on that one. And then in Brooklyn, Bronx, and Queens again, you have your political party county committee. So that's your county leadership for your county party. Republicans have this, but working families and libertarians who have real political parties, they actually don't have a county committee structure where you tend to have elected county committee members. It's a long story. We're not going to go into how lesser parties operate in New York. There are specific laws for the two largest parties, strangely enough. And that's sort of it. So now let's just spend a little bit of time talking about the delegate selection process, voting strategy, and then we're going to do a little bit of international news. But first, let us see these comments here. Dorian Key, who always has great comments. Oh, Simon Sachs put the link for the absentee ballot request. Again, if you want to vote by mail, you have to fill that out tonight. It takes 10 seconds. You can do it right now. Dorian Key, hey, are you going to read John Bolton's book? And do you think it deserves to be published? Or do you support executive authority and secrecy over all internal discussions? Don't you despise John Bolton? Now, John Bolton is the former ambassador to the UN and former, I believe, defense secretary. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to lump that into international relations right after we talk about delegates. And Dorian Key, wow, 8 viewers, 4 minutes in. I guess you have a solid core of regulars. I think so. I definitely think there's a solid core of regulars. And it's nice to see everybody every night. And then every so often, the highest I think we've had concurrently is like 14 or 15 people. So maybe we should set some goals, try and get to 20 or something. But I'm limited in how much I can share this while I'm actually doing it because I have only so many devices. That being said, let's talk about delegates for a second because people are voting now. So as we've discussed, the Democratic nominee for president is chosen at the Democratic National Convention. But even though you vote directly for that nominee, they don't actually receive your vote. What they receive are delegates at the convention. So when you vote for your Democratic nominee, what it does is apportion the delegate pool in your district. For example, if your district has 10 delegates and one candidate wins 100% of the vote in your area, then they get all 10 delegates. But if, say, Bernie Sanders gets 40% of the vote and Joe Biden gets 60% of the vote, then Joe Biden will get 6 delegates and Bernie Sanders will get 4 delegates. But because every candidate could theoretically win 100% of the vote, they generally find enough delegate candidates to fill out an entire slate. So when you go and vote and one candidate gets 7 delegates and another candidate gets 3 delegates, or one candidate gets 5 delegates and 2 candidates get 2 delegates and so on, how to determine which delegates actually go to the convention? Well, that has to do with how many votes each individual delegate got, which is why you can vote for a presidential nominee and you can vote separately for delegates in any nominee's column. The way this used to be done is you would just vote for your nominee. The way this used to be done is you would just vote for your delegates. You would vote for your representatives to your party convention. And they would go and just decide amongst themselves at the convention who would be the party's nominee for president. Famously, for example, the Republican Party chose Abraham Lincoln after going through and picking not their first top choice, not their second top choice, not their third top choice, but settling on their 4th choice, an unknown congressman, really, from Ohio. Now, he wasn't entirely unknown because he had become somewhat famous in the Lincoln-Douglas debates held at the Cooper Union right behind me. But he was nowhere near as famous as some other staunch abolitionist Republicans, such as Seward and Chase, who were big leaders in the party. But because their factions were so strong, but not a majority of the convention, and you need a majority to pick a nominee, they had to find a compromise candidate. So they went through quite a few, and they eventually settled on Lincoln. Now, what that meant was Republican Party members at that time didn't vote for the nominee. They simply sent their representatives, the delegates, to figure it out. In the modern era, when we have this idea of popular democracy, which is that folks vote directly for the people who represent them, not just at the convention, but in the nomination process, delegates align themselves, pledge themselves to a particular nominee to make it easier for folks to determine which candidates for delegate they want to send, because they want a particular person to win the nomination, so they should vote for delegates who are pledged to that person and presumably support that person's platform. Okay, so even though we have these folks who are now running with a nominee, you're more than able to vote for a nominee and then vote separately for any delegate you want who's running with any candidate you want. Now, why would you vote for delegates who are not aligned with your candidate? Well, first, when you vote for your candidate, that's allotting the proportion of delegates. So if you vote for Bernie Sanders, for example, you're helping Bernie Sanders get more delegates. Nothing you do after that will reduce the number of Sanders delegates. And I bring up this because it's an actual question that was posed on Facebook, which I answered by somebody who was voting today. So nothing you do after that will reduce the amount of delegates Bernie Sanders gets. You awarded him your vote, and that brings up his delegate total. Now, if you go to vote for an Elizabeth Warren candidate for a delegate who you happen to know, that might actually be helpful. How would that be helpful? Well, you assume that all of the Bernie Sanders delegates will vote for Sanders at the convention. Well, in fact, they have to. They're pledged to do so, and that's it's part of the law. But assuming that Bernie Sanders doesn't win the nomination, those delegates will still be important for formulating the party platform and helping to rewrite or recreate the party rules at the convention. So if you happen to trust Sanders to lead his delegates in a particular way, but you want to make sure that delegates in another person's cohort are sympathetic to your cause as opposed to sympathetic to, you've got Warren delegates who lean left to Biden, and also Warren delegates who lean left to Sanders, and also delegates who lean center to Biden. You want to try and get the delegates that are most likely to stand up and support your position. So if you're a Sanders delegate voting for a Warren, if you're a Sanders supporter, rather, then voting for a Warren delegate and who is left-leaning can actually help your cause. And so that is voting strategy for presidential delegates and presidential candidates. Now, if you don't happen to know any delegates personally or know where they stand, and you can't find them on Facebook or the internet or something, then I'm afraid you're just sort of out of luck. But this is the situation for most voters, unfortunately. You have to be sort of in these circles to know the folks who are running for delegate. All right, now let's get to this international stuff. So, well, actually, one cool thing before we get to the two news stories I wanted to cover, and again, there's really not that much going on today, so that's nice. We'll probably get to Magna Carta. There is a very rare Ring of Fire solar eclipse going down on June 21st. Now, we won't see this here in the United States, which is sad because they're super duper cool. It's going to be an eclipse that happens over Africa and Asia and the Middle East. But this Ring of Fire eclipse is where you have a solar eclipse, but the moon is at aphelion. Perihelion? The moon is far from the Earth. I think perihelion. The moon is far from the Earth, so it's small. And as a result, the corona of the sun rings around the moon. So it's not a total blockage, and it creates a relatively thick band of fire around the moon, creating the Ring of Fire effect. So this is rather rare. And so that just goes to show that 2020 is the year of all the rare things happening, and that the omens are, let's just say that there's omens. There's omens for the rest of 2020. Okay, speaking of what those omens might portend, we've got some stuff happening in Asia. And we've spoken about China a fair bit on the show, but there are some things happening in Asia which I think we should all take note of, particularly given that the other day, all of Honda's factories were shut down in a cyber attack, and it would appear that somehow all the cell networks in pockets of the United States were also shut down. Finally, it was released today that there was a major theft of cyber offense tools from the CIA in 2016, but we're only learning about it now. So are these things related? I have no idea. But what I can say is that there seem to be some cyber shenanigans going on, and hot on the heels of what might be tests of U.S. critical infrastructure, we have a skirmish of military on the border of Kashmir between India and China. Now, there's been some bad blood between these two countries for a long time. 1962, they fought the Sino-Indian War, which really left a foul taste in both of their mouths. And during that war, the Galloway Valley was ceded from China to India. Now, at the time, it was thought by China that India was trying to challenge China's rule in Tibet. And it had come right after India agreed to grant asylum to the Dalai Lama. But that being said, we haven't seen any real conflict between China and India since 1975. Now we've got two major nuclear powers that have actually killed each other's soldiers. So 20 Indian soldiers are dead and 43 Chinese soldiers are injured, although we have no death count from the Chinese side. And in particular, this was a rather brutal happening. there were no shots fired. This was done exclusively with hand-to-hand combat with batons and rocks. So pretty solid. And it's never great to see two regional powers with 1 billion people, nuclear weapons, grudges to settle, and an absent, shall we say, U.S. influence going at each other's throats. This is like actually quite a dangerous situation. China is traditionally not a country which is anxious to start violent conflicts. They're generally very good about biding their time and not engaging in violence, because they much prefer to test the waters, knowing that they're in a militarily inferior position to the United States and its network of allies in the region. India being an ally of the U.S. is, I think, a pretty big move, both on India and China's parts. Now, it's not clear who instigated this thing. China claims that India was illegally in the Galloway Valley, although, again, Galloway Valley does belong to India. And then there are further reports that India was illegally setting up military defenses in the region. That might be something else. But for this to come to blows and to killing is, I think it's very clear that the absence of U.S. power is felt, and that people all around the world are starting to test the limits of what they can do without getting into trouble, without receiving condemnation, without receiving economic sanctions or further economic consequences, and certainly testing whether the United States will even pretend to consider the use of force. And this is only underscored by the fact that Korea just blew up a joint liaison office that it has with South Korea. So North Korea blew up a joint liaison office it holds with South Korea. Now, this office is on the north side, and it's been abandoned since January, just like all of our hopes for a peaceful and prosperous 2020. But it's still a pretty big move because it is actual destruction in a military action. However, again, it is on the north side. South Korea condemned it, but we'll see what happens. The big question is, why would North Korea bother to escalate tensions with South Korea in this moment? Your guess is as good as mine on this one. Maybe Kim Jong-un just wants to reassert the fact that he's not dead and is not weak. But with these two tests of stability from, in Asia, one of them being between two of the entities that are supposed to be propping up the stability of the region, India and China, global and regional powers, it's pretty bad. And China's been very clear that it views Donald Trump and America's current situation as a incurable death spiral of American hegemony. So we shall see what comes of all of this. But I am personally a little bit concerned that without third parties stepping in, tensions could escalate. So let's talk about John Bolton. John Bolton is a war hawk. He is someone who very much wanted to bomb Iran throughout all of his career and was being very, very hard for it while he stood in the Trump administration. He also wanted to bomb North Korea, as I recall. Now, that being said, John Bolton is no longer in the Trump administration. Instead, he's publishing a book about everything he experienced that went on, culminating in his firing as ambassador to the UN. Fascinating stuff. It's even more fascinating that the Trump administration has sued to prevent the publication of that book before the election. Well, sued to prevent the publication of the book at all happens to be that this could be a bad piece of PR for the election. Let's take these comments now from Dorian because they were about that. So let's get into it. So, are you going to read Bolton's book, and do you think it deserves to be published, or do you support executive authority and secrecy over all internal discussion? Don't you despise John Bolton? 1, I despise John Bolton. 2, I don't know if I'm going to read his book. Maybe. Depends what the reviews are like. I kind of have a sense of what it'll say. 3, do I think it should be published, or do I support executive authority and secrecy over internal discussions? Well, I think you know where I stand on this. I am a huge proponent of transparency and a huge proponent for reducing the power of the executive. And I believe that the executive has far too many privileges that prevent it from being held accountable while a president is in office, which leads us down a dictatorial or authoritarian path every time a president isn't held accountable. And preventing any information about discussions from leaking or from being published aids that. That being said, obviously we need limitations in the interest of national security. So if you ask me, it should go to the Senate and House Congressional Intelligence committees. They should review it and take a vote on whether or not to release it. In my preference, the vote of a single chamber would be enough to release it, so long as the entire body, it didn't just go through the committee, but then it went to the entire body and they voted for it. Hopefully, things wouldn't be so partisan that people would vote to publish materials that would be detrimental to the national security of the country. I absolutely expect people to be partisan enough to try and conceal materials that wouldn't be detrimental, which is why I call for a single chamber to be the ratifying entity. But that being said, whether or not you can trust the defense or intelligence communities or the White House to make a fair determination as to whether or not their discussion should be published, I certainly don't think you can. Julian Ballantyne, Carolyn Maloney was absolutely awesome during her debate. We can talk about that. Lol. I didn't watch her debate today, honestly, so I don't know anything about what transpired. I can't say much. I suppose I'm happy for Carolyn. She's been a congresswoman for a long, long time. I respect some of her work, but not all of it. Although she has some really, really fleet-footed challengers as well. So I do think she's got a real fight on her hands. And she's got at least 4 challengers. Yeah, she's got 4 challengers all told right now. Suraj Patel, Lauren Ashcraft, and Pete Harrison. Erica Vladimir, who was one of my favorite candidates, unfortunately dropped out. She would have been amazing. Of these 3, Suraj Patel is probably the biggest threat, simply because he has enough money to make it a real race. Lauren Ashcraft and Pete Harrison are both... one with, Suraj Patel is running to the left of Carolyn Maloney, but I would say that Lauren Ashcraft and Pete Harrison are really the well-known and stalwart left of center folks who are members of DSA. Pete's been an activist for a long time. Lauren has been a member of DSA, and I believe just got involved recently. She worked for what was it? One of the banks, either JP Morgan Chase or Bank of America, I think, and left that because she couldn't take it anymore. She did compliance for them and was just like, you guys are not compliant enough. I'm leaving. Pete Harrison, I actually forget what his background is, but I want to say housing organizer. But that might just be because he's done a lot of housing organizing independently of his job. So suffice it to say, I am not competent to deliver a verdict on that debate. And I still have to refresh my memory on the candidates to sound intelligent on New York 12. Although that is my district, and I'm going to have to vote, and I probably should make an endorsement at some point. And I sort of have my preferences, but I need to get the facts right so I can delineate those in a respectable way. But listen, my endorsements are always, and my voting pattern is always based on truly defensible rationales. And that is why when I send out my endorsement emails, everybody shares them like crazy, because very, very strong argumentation for my candidates. And that is also why I haven't sent one yet, even though I understand that voting has taken place. One, I usually wait until the last minute because I want to take in everything that's going on. And two, they require a lot of research and a lot of writing. And it's just been an incredibly busy time, as I'm sure folks understand. Dorian Key, if possible, would you support a free and independent Tibet and Hong Kong on the Singapore model? Okay, yeah, if possible. If possible, I'm for democratic federalism everywhere. If possible, I'd support China being a democratic federal government in the model of the United States or the EU or Switzerland or something. But like, it's just not possible. China's not that. It's not even likely to become that in the near future, although 2020 is full of surprises. So would I support an independent Tibet, a free and independent Tibet? Well, first, you'd have to tell me whether that Tibet is going to be democratic. If it's not going to be democratic, what's the point? No. But on the assumption that it will be democratic or less authoritarian than China, yes. Hong Kong, well, if Hong Kong's government were to stay what Hong Kong's government was before China ruined it, then yeah, absolutely. And Singapore isn't the most democratic place on earth, but it's far from the most authoritarian place on earth. So if you're saying that both of these places would then behave like Singapore, I would support that. But it's just geopolitically not going to happen. Again, the entire reason for the Sino-Indian War in 1962 was a suspected undermining of Chinese rule in Tibet. So it's not likely that China's going to let go of either of those provinces. Dorian continues. What strategic interest does China have along the Indian border? It just seems like uninhabitable, rocky land of no value to me. That is a good question. And the answer, the direct response to that is you are right. It's relatively uninhabitable. It is just rocky and barren. There was a quote, I forget by whom it was, that, they're fighting over a place where not even a blade of grass can grow. So it's not like it's arable land. Maybe there's minerals under there. I don't think so. I mean, we probably would have heard of that by now, I suppose. But but at the end of the day, borders like that are about two things: buffer zones, and well, actually three things: buffer zones, high ground, and just pride, I guess you'd say, nationalism. Now, those two areas, the areas which India and China contest, there's two of them. One is the Galloway Valley, which is like by the Indian state of Jammu and Kashmir, and then the other is to the east of that, bordering Tibet, another bordering of Tibet. Now, neither of those two places are particularly strategic, so you needn't occupy them. Like, India doesn't get a huge military advantage over China because it occupies this valley. So what this really comes down to is buffer area, which is space between another country and your capital or your major cities or production hubs or populous areas or strategic resources, and nationalism. So the buffer zone, the buffer area, makes a lot of sense. Russia's really into this. One of the reasons that Israel refuses to accept the 1967 partition is because losing the West Bank puts in, antagonistic countries mere miles from Jerusalem. They could shoot Jerusalem from their side of the border. They could invade in an hour's or a 20-minute drive to Jerusalem. And that's one of the major security concerns of giving back the West Bank, of basically going back to the original partition. The space between a major strategically important city and enemy territory is just so narrow. So this provides buffer space because Tibet's quite large, and so keeping people out of that space is important. or preserving as much of the space as you can is important. That being said, these are small pockets, so it's probably not about that, which brings us to the last component, which is simply countries want their borders. They just want them, you know? Like, they'll fight over little patches of land. They'll fight over tiny islands in the South China Sea. They'll fight over one side of a creek or another side of a creek, just because you don't want to give anything and because you want to say, we own it. We have it. It looks good in the press to your people to say we expanded the borders of our country or what have you. So ultimately, I believe that's what it comes down to. And honestly, not much else. Nothing more than to say, hey, that was ours and you can't have it. And of course, every country believes that the thing that somebody else took or somebody else has was originally there. That's what disputed territory means. And you just don't want to give up the dispute. Plus, then you can use it as a bargaining chip for things that actually do matter. Yeah, well, we'll agree not to talk about this or raise issues about this if you give us a concession here, right? And so they're kind of useful as bargaining chips sometimes. Dorian's got a lot today. Could you talk about the grand scale? Can you talk on the grand scale about great power politics and Western decline and if it is irreversible? China seems to have systemic advantages that free democracies do not have access to. Do you see a parallel between decline and fall of the British Empire and America, with America losing its hyperpower status? All right, big question, always fun to talk about. And the short answer is, the short answer is no. I do not think that Western decline is irreversible, especially not American decline. Now, I love my country, and I think we get a lot going for us. But the biggest reason I don't think that America is in irreversible decline is because everybody thought America was in irreversible decline at the end of the Cold War. And we all know how that turned out. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the United States had a rebirth of economic productivity ushered in by the invention and expansion of the internet. So, at that time, everybody was a polemicist saying the United States is in terminal decline and it will never fish itself out of what was at the time, the drug war, economic stagflation, inner city gangs running wild. Everybody thought it was over for the United States. Nobody saw the Soviet Union falling apart overnight. So my first rule of thumb is never count the United States out. And we have I think, a lot of structural advantages that China doesn't have. But that being said, I'd like to scroll down and maybe see if you delineate some of the advantages you think China does possess, because I think that the only way to understand the future of the global economy and the global allotment of power is to understand the strengths and weaknesses of the various players. So let's see what you've written down below. If you were Russia or China with superior cyber espionage resources, how would you try to exploit racial inequality and tension to undermine the United States and hasten the decline as the hegemonic power? Simon Sachs, can you read excerpts from Bolton's book? If I get Bolton's book, I can read excerpts from it. And let's see if Dorian has anything else. Okay. So this could be a super long discussion. This is going to be decently involved. So let's just get to the other comments, and then we'll come back to a grand thesis for great power relations in the 21st century. That'd be awesome. Get the book and read it. Yeah, well, everybody wants me to be their book on tape, and then I buy the book and everybody else gets the book for free. But I'll seriously consider it. Julianne, speaking of the debate with Callum Maloney, she was great. She beat Siraj down. Damn. Pete does have a background in housing. You might hate Bolton, says Dorian, as a neocon, but do you respect him and think he will be honest on Trump? I don't respect what hard to say. I don't think Bolton's a liar, if that's what you mean, but I don't really respect him because I think his view of global politics is insanity, just crazy. You should do a SWOT analysis of China versus the US one of these days. That is exactly what I was thinking. When I was thinking of strengths and weaknesses, I was exactly thinking of a SWOT analysis. Yes. Dorian Keith, Ben, I'll Venmo you the money for the book. Let's just hope it gets published. Thanks, Dory. Maybe I can do a fundraiser. Help Ben raise $25 for John Bolton's book, and he'll read it out loud to you, excerpt by excerpt. Okay, let's do the great power analysis. We can do a SWOT analysis sometime. That I think would actually be really fun. But let's just talk a moment, in short or glibly about the United States versus China as it is. So, first and foremost, you alluded to the fact that the racial divisions in the United States are a part of the United States' decline as a great power. And what I would say to you is that is exactly the reason people thought the United States would implode in the 1960s and the 1980s. What we're going through right now isn't an implosion. It's an acceptance. And we spoke about this maybe 3 nights ago in the conversation on allyship, I believe. The United States is unique in its capacity to absorb and learn from other cultures. One of the big difficulties that still plagues the United States, though, is that it tends to pick and choose aspects of those cultures to imbibe and then aspects to put off. However, you can't put these things off forever. Black culture, for example, comes from a place laden with the history of slavery and Jim Crow and all of these other aspects of American culture. The acceptance and bringing in of aspects like hip hop, rock and roll, all this entertainment stuff, sports and athletes. These were all aspects of Black culture which the United States took because it was easy. And eventually there would have to be a reckoning. And every time the United States takes from a culture, it eventually has to grapple with the other aspects that it has decided to ignore. And what we are going through now is one of those periods when the United States is having to grapple with the things it doesn't want to look at. This happens periodically. Like I said, this isn't the first time it's happened. Civil rights movement, gang violence in the 80s, or like that war on drug stuff, all of these things were attempts to grapple with historical inequality, and they didn't do a good job. The Civil War also, I forgot about the Civil War, right? So the racial division in the United States, I think one of the things that the George Floyd protests has shown us is that there's a lot less division than we might think. The divisions are very much highlighted, and Russia and perhaps China are using social media to intensify that divide by pumping American discourse full of incendiary and divisive messaging. But that is not, I don't think we should view that as something that's going to bring down the United States. I think what it does do is it hastens our need to deal with these issues. It certainly puts a huge impetus on Americans to control their own discourse and deal with these problems locally and not nationally over social media, to deal with it locally in conversation with neighbors and with police departments and with local elected officials. And if we can do that, this is not going to be something that leads to American decline. It's going to be something that props up American success for years and years to come. The best thing we can do is grapple with our past and develop institutions that allow us to bring in other cultures in a productive and responsible way. And the United States has been working on that for 300 years. And we have not done a great job of it, but we've done so much better than almost every country on the face of the planet. And as long as we can continue that, the story of American success is, I think, one we'll be able to tell for a long, long time. Because one of China's most difficult struggles and greatest weaknesses is that it relies on a homogenous national identity, like so many other countries. And that means that they're incapable, one, of incorporating foreign ideas that make them stronger, and two, making other people feel like they have a stake in China's success. In theory, every person in every country on this planet can have a stake in the success of the United States. And the better we do, the better they do, because they have the opportunity and right to come to this country and be Americans. Whether they do that or not is another question. Whether we are good at incorporating them or not is another question. What our immigration laws are like is another question. But nobody is looking to China and saying, someday I hope to be Chinese. It's not even an option. So, in that regard, as much as China and Russia want to stoke racial divisions, and as much as that is a unique American, sometimes we go back and forth as to whether or not that is a unique American problem. Every place has racial divisions. The unique challenge of the United States is not that we have ethnic division. It's that the United States is not supposed to have ethnic division. That everybody here is supposed to be equal, and we're all supposed to share in the idea and ideals of the United States. And that's what makes our challenge unique, but I would view that as a strength. It might seem like it can be exploited, and I suppose it can, but it only gets exploited in the echo chamber of social media and national messaging, really. It's not something that's so easy to exploit in person-to-person community building exercises, which I think is really the base of democracy in our country, or at the very least it should be. We've gotten way too far away from local organizing, grassroots politics, caring about our local elections, and going to those town hall meetings where, or I suppose now Zoom meetings, where these things really happen. And I suppose now we've got the risk of Russian trolls coming into a town hall Zoom meeting and saying stuff, whereas they would not have sent over hundreds of thousands of Russians to attend a live town hall meeting. But ultimately, it's that community aspect of our democracy that will save us. Now, admittedly, it's not impossible for this whole thing to implode. It's not impossible for the Boogaloo or the race war or any of these things to happen. I just think that they're less likely than us overcoming this. I think it's less likely than people becoming increasingly skeptical of social media at this point. And if we can pull through this, it's going to be one of our strongest assets, like it's always been. Now, we've got a bunch of other super strong assets that put us at an advantage to the Chinese. But now I've said a fair bit, so let's look at these comments for a second. And maybe we'll just leave it at the racial dynamic, the ethnic dynamic in the United States versus the ethnic dynamic in China, and which one of us is better positioned. All right, Dorian Key. China has 1.6 billion people, and the world economy is completely reliant on it and is expected to surpass the US economy within the next 10 to 20 years. That's pretty grim, don't you think? Even so-called allies like Italy and Australia are all on the Chinese money Kool-Aid. Meanwhile, Russia continues to try and sabotage us constantly out of spite. Yeah, and the threats. So we're talking about the SWOT analysis, right? The threats facing the United States are not insignificant. That being said, the United States, I have always found and believed, is an incredibly resilient country. It's a country which keeps figuring out a way. It's the old Churchill. It's the old Churchill quote. America always does the right thing. after she has exhausted all other options. But the rate at which America keeps trying random stuff and ends up with success is absolutely incredible. I mean, China, you know, there is something to be said for sheer population. And then there's something to be said for productivity. All right. So it is true that China is the second biggest market in the world now after India. And it is also true that the Chinese government's stewardship of their economy has been, let's say, exemplary amongst the nations as far as directed economies go. But we can say maybe three things about that, and then I'm going to make one more comparison, which I hope puts into perspective just how this can come out in America's favor. The first is humans make mistakes. The biggest, not only do they make mistakes, but they make bad decisions based on incentives which are misaligned with what they should be doing. For example, the number one thing that libertarians and free market folks are always most concerned about is being at the mercy of a bureaucrat, right? And ultimately, the economies of centralized Soviet China and the Soviet Union were ones which had inefficient allocation of resources because the decisions weren't made by individuals making decisions locally based on what they needed or what they wanted. It was made by bureaucrats. This deprived a lot of people of a lot of things, but it also prevented people from trying new things or sending signals for how resources could be productively used. So command economies have some advantages, particularly in a recession, because you can do things that you know need to be done quickly, and you can keep people employed because individual businesses aren't on the hook for making sure that people have jobs. It's the government. But at the same time, they lag in other ways. There are other things that they're not great at. One of them is the deployment of resources, and one of them is allowing individuals who are ambitious or who have perverse incentives to misuse resources. So people talk about all of the cities that China's built in the desert that nobody's living in. Now, I heard a theory that all of them were built for global warming so that all of China's population could rapidly move inland when the sea levels rise. It just seems unlikely. Like, why would you build them then? Obviously, China can build things very, very rapidly now, and they're investing tremendously in infrastructure in coastal cities. So that doesn't really seem to make sense. Rather, it looks like people are trying to boost their production numbers and their GDP numbers. So there is that aspect. And then we might further say that population isn't everything. While certainly it's often the case that the economy is proportional to the number of people, it's also proportional to the productivity of the workers. And this is the great insight of Adam Smith, which is that it's not scarce natural resources or gold or what have you that makes a country rich. It is the capacity to produce. As long as I can produce, I can sell. As long as I can produce, I can provide. And what people want to trade, and this is why I don't believe in Bitcoin, and I have very hard time understanding why people use gold as a store of value. That has no intrinsic value. Like I'm a serious economic liberal, which is that to say, and this is not even like free markets, blah, blah, blah. The main thing about economic liberals is that Adam Smith said production is the value of the economy. If you can produce, you have something worthwhile. And it's not the gold that's worthwhile. It's not the dollar that's worthwhile. It is the boot that's worthwhile, the food that's worthwhile, the computer that's worthwhile. And so let's just look again at the 1980s and 1990s when the United States was overrun by a rising economic star that was on track to to overtake its development. What rising star was that? Not the Soviet Union, it was Japan, a small island nation. And before that, your reference to the British Empire didn't get rich by having a lot of people on the island of Britain. The British Empire got rich through outproducing everybody because of technological gains, through high productivity per individual. So having a captive market definitely helps you. 1 billion people to sell to, that is good for spurring economic development and new innovation, because the demand market is so large that the economic transactions can support new business activities. But if you're not an economy set up to innovate, to support new business activities, then you are in you can't take full advantage of that resource. And the last thing, I guess the third thing, is that China is often viewed as a leader and a world leader because it invests so much in technology. The United States, we invest a lot in technology at the government level, but a lot of it is also done at the corporate level, right? There's private research and development. And the battery technology coming out of China, all of these things, that is definitely an advantage for them. They're able to devote these resources to these really important sectors because they have a government-led economy. But the United States has a demand-led economy. And so our innovations, there's always a tension between guns and butter in economics, which is basically, should we invest in military stuff or should we invest in consumer stuff? That's like the big question. That's like your simplified economy. The United States does invest a lot in military on the government side, but that's a small fraction of our GDP. Even though we outspend all of the other countries, next 11 countries combined, it's still a smaller fraction of our GDP than China spends on military hardware and research and development. And on top of that, so much more research and development happens in the private sector. Battery technology, where's that coming from? Elon Musk and Tesla. Rockets from Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. These are all things which are driven by consumer demand. So there's productive value in making them. People will buy them and you can spur the economy in that way. When the work you're doing doesn't spur more economic activity, or because people won't consume it, then it's just like how do you grow that economy? So China might produce a bunch of stuff, but where is the growth factor there? Their cutting edge things are driven by government demand. And yeah, everybody needs batteries. So that's a thing. And they've got their mobile phones and they've got their 5G and what have you. I'm not saying that there's a threat from China, but the United States is set up to develop technologies that have a market and are self-sustaining and don't need constant government funding, which is great because if we look at the US debt and the US government capacity to support things, that might be decreasing substantially. That's absolutely true. And China is in a strong position to continue with its government funding and government subsidizing of all of these really important activities. The important thing about the United States is that it doesn't need the government. Our government, when it works well, puts us light years ahead of competitors, but we don't need it to work well per se. We do need it not to destroy everything. Donald Trump in that regard is terrible, but the private sector, and people will, certainly on the left, they'll balk sometimes at the value of the private sector, but the private sector's capacity to operate independent of what the government is doing is a huge advantage. Whenever China's government falters, it will, what's going to happen? Like all of its state-owned industries, all of its subsidized industries, all of these people who rely on government largesse are going to experience pain. In the United States, businesses are self-reliant and self-sustaining for the most part. Obviously, we know that there's corporations that get corporate welfare. But so I wouldn't put too much stake. I'm not going to say it's not important, but I wouldn't say there's too much. You shouldn't put too much value or too much stock just on the fact that China has a lot of people. Remember, The world has something like 8.5 billion people in it now. Maybe it's 9 at this point. China has 1.5 of them. India has another 1.5 of them. And we're allied with India for the moment. Then there's Europe, which has a larger market than the United States. Then there's the US itself, and there's Africa, which is it's an entire continent full of people, which is rapidly developing. For all we know, the next superpower comes out of Africa, not North America and not Asia. Wow, that was long. But, interesting stuff. I'm at an hour now, though, so I'm probably going to stop talking. Tony Romano, are you in here yet? Any thoughts on China? Asked Dorian. Don't you think increasing income inequality, winner-take-all capitalism, and the complete hollowing out of heavy industry a huge disadvantage in worrying in a Sino-American Cold War? The first two, yes, I'm not so worried about lost heavy industrial capacity, because the United States, we actually have more manufacturing than we did. Like, our manufacturing production is going up. What's not going up is our manufacturing jobs. And again, I go back to the example of Japan. We've got more robotics. We've got more 3D printing. These are all things that the United States is doing more of. It's just not, people don't talk about it because it doesn't create those jobs. People talk about, the lost jobs. Yeah, but manufacturing is not it's not like we're not producing anything physical anymore. We're just not using people to do it. As for inequality and winner-take-all capitalism, those will destroy the United States. It will destroy the private sector by creating monopolies that drive out everybody else, and it will destroy our democratic politics, and it will destroy our society. Yes. Dorian Key, whereas China makes 80% of the world's large commercial ships and exports 60% of its steel, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, what are they going to do with all that? I mean, make tanks, I guess, or something, but the United States is not outclassed militarily. And so if we're talking about a war of attrition or something, I just, that's not where the new wars are going to be waged. It's high technology. It's who can do the better hacking and who can do the better hardening. And yeah, we're very bad. We're not bad at it. We're not known for it. Just look at Stuxnet, right? That came out of the US. We destroyed an Iranian facility. We basically turned an Iranian centrifuge into a bomb. But you didn't know about that until way after it happened because we had Israel do it. It was actually mentioned on a previous live by somebody from the intelligence community, or defense community. But, that's where the battles are being fought. Everything is wired in now. So how we deal with that is really a bigger question than how many tanks we can produce. And we can still produce a lot of tanks. Dorian Key, and has an army equal to the population of the United States. They had, in 1958, China entered the Korean War. 58? I want to say 58. China entered the Korean War. In that war, they had an army not just equal to the population of the United States, but an army that dwarfed the American military in Korea. And they just came rolling across the Yalu River. And guess what? They had a lot of gains. But then at the 48th parallel, the line got drawn and they weren't able to do that much with it. What do you do with it? Even if you had a 1 billion person army, what do you do with them? You just run into bullet fire? How many people can you use? Of course, wars of attrition, all these things. Yes, it does make a difference. But the deployment of 1 billion people against what? Armored vehicles, against smart bombs, against drones? Just sheer numbers of people isn't what it used to be. Dorian Key, Xi Jinping has absolute power without any checks on his will, which is bad for China as far as I'm concerned. And I don't mean it's bad for the Chinese people, which it is. I mean, it's bad for Chinese government to give somebody that much power. Dorian, What is Biden's China policy? I'm afraid he will pull a Nixon and go to China and play right into their hands since he wants to avoid conflict at all costs. You really have to ask who benefits more from conflict. And I'm not sure it's the United States. Sweet, we made it past an hour tonight. Time for the Magna Carta. Tony Romano just wants to reemphasize that not needing government is the key to our strength. That's true. I do think that that's a strength in the United States, and I do think that, there's something to be said for understanding the value of private initiative or individual initiative. Like, these are not things that we should scoff at, and it is in fact something that makes the United States a unique and valuable addition to the community of nations. And we shouldn't want to eliminate that or adopt somebody else's model for it. That being said, the Scandinavian countries definitely have a nice mix of government-run programs that help facilitate capitalism. Did you know that the United States is not at the top of the free market index, and that parts of Europe rank more highly? Yeah, think about it. Our culture in the United States is nice, but it's great when we have good government, and government can do amazing things, really, really great things. But the fact that we don't need it is definitely something that is a strength. China has Africa in its pocket. Do you know about their Belt and Road Initiative? Every African government has massive loans from China. Yeah, that's true. And the African governments hate China for it. So I'm familiar. Now, they did hate the United States when we did the exact same thing back in the 60s and 70s during the Cold War. And Latin America was our stomping grounds in that way. And we really made a mess of it. But, by that token, you can sort of see what China's trajectory might be like. And it's not one that is necessarily so rosy. Now, we've been at this for some time. Thank you for the inspiring and intriguing questions. Let's do one section of the Magna Carta. And then it's off to, the next thing. All right. 25, 26. Nope, 27. If a free man dies intestate, his movable goods are to be distributed by his next of kin and friends under the supervision of the church. The rights of his debtors are to be preserved. Let's find out what intestate means, because that's definitely important to understanding. Without a will. Oh, so interesting. So interesting. So if a man dies without a will, remember this is 1215 England, it's basically only men. If a free man dies without a will, intestate, his movable goods are to be distributed by his next of kin and friends under the supervision of the church. The rights of his debtors are to be preserved. Now, in the United States, the rights of debtors are preserved, and without a will, the movable goods are then distributed not by the next of kin, but by, at least in New York State, surrogates court. And the surrogates court acts as and provides an executor, which manages the estate and then is entitled to 5% of the estate. This is why surrogates court is a bastion of corruption, and, well, it's legal corruption, but in Queens, for example, all surrogate court matters, all of these estate handlings, or these intestate handlings, I should say, go to a single law firm, Sweeney, Reich and Bowles, which was allied with Joe Crowley, the former leader of the Queens County Democratic Party, which makes judges. We won't go into how, but know that that's the case for the moment. They have made millions and millions. I think it's something like $30 million, or no, it's like $1 million a year. So it's like $10 million in the last 10 years, a little bit more, managing estates that have no will for the families. And so this is very interesting. It says that this is, in some regards, maybe even better. if a free man dies without a will, his movable goods are to be distributed by his next of kin and friends. It doesn't allot for them any executor's fee, and it's not the government. Now, it's under the supervision of the church, and it doesn't preserve any value for the church in this, but that's basically how you deal with somebody who dies with property but no will. It might almost be better, well, except for the influence of the church, it might almost be better than the cut that the government takes to give to an appointed executor, potentially making the friends of the politically connected wealthier by the day. All right, and that brings us to the end of today, except there's a lot of flags here. And Dorian says, Michael Labar does not approve, but if you say so. And then, okay, we did the Magna Carta. Now it's late. So I'll see you all tomorrow at 8:30.